Good afternoon, graduating class of 2022 and 2020. Thank you, President Smith, Dr. Foy, the Board of Managers, and the greater Swarthmore community. Today's remarks, my last as a professor of history at Swarthmore College, are for you, the soon-to-be alumni of this august institution, and for those alumni of previous years who studied with me. Swarthmore College students introduced me to many things: popular culture idioms and foolishness, the music and poetry of Jill Scott and Megan Thee Stallion, and most important, they have always challenged me to think about old stories in new ways, for which I am grateful. Still, I was reluctant to accept the honor of serving as your final lecturer. The vast majority of students assembled here and in my 25 years at Swarthmore College never ventured near a course in African American history. Some boldly declared that the Black past was too painful, and others that my teaching about slavery failed to uplift Black people. More egregious still, a recent student demanded that I stop speaking, specifically noting, quote, "More people in this room agree with me than with you, so you should just stop speaking." Ironically, this dismissive command brought me to the podium today, reflecting on every Black woman in my personal tribe, and all of those other Black women, past and present, who have been told to stop speaking. I had no choice but to rise to the occasion and to use my platform to share a bit of truth and offer some thoughts learned college graduates might find useful. I remain unrelenting and unapologetic in my commitment to teaching Black history. The story of our quest for justice and the development of strategies and hard-earned skills of survival, knowledge of which is essential for all who wish to understand the American past and present. Bell Hooks, Octavia Butler, Toni Morrison, Maya Angelou, Nikki Giovanni, Cheryl Lynn Eiffel, Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Ida B. Wells all served as intellectual mentors and guides in the arc of my teaching career. Rereading and reflection brought to mind their voices, their insights, and any wisdom I may share today. And of course, there will be a brief lesson in history. Visionary and multi-award-winning novelist Octavia Butler began to write science fiction and fantasy as she said, quote, "When I began reading, heck, I wasn't in any of this stuff I read. I wrote myself in. Since I'm me, and I'm here, and I'm writing." With those few simple sentences, Butler captured the story of the Black experience. Brought to these shores, battered and bruised and in chains, Black people wrote ourselves into the story of the nation, and in the process, enhanced and redefined democracy in America. The chief document of American democracy is soon to be 235 years old, as the nation's Constitution was written in 1787 and ratified in 1788 and in operation since 1789. America did not, however, approach democracy in practice until after the Civil War, after the passage of numerous amendments, and after the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century. The battle to end chattel slavery did not begin with white abolitionists, but with Black enslaved human beings determined to free ourselves and their brethren. The passage and ratification of the 13th Amendment elevated the Constitution, formally making it an anti-slavery document, thereby ending what William Lloyd Garrison called, quote, "a covenant with death and an agreement with hell." The 14th Amendment followed, granting birthright citizenship and establishing equal protection under law. The last of the Reconstruction Amendments, the 15th, secured the right of franchise for men, irrespective of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. These changes were forward-thinking and potentially revolutionary. Thus empowered, Black men enthusiastically joined the American democratic project as they sat on juries, pursued elective office, and wrote progressive laws, working to make a fuller freedom available to the 4 million formerly enslaved the nation over. Had their white peers, male and female, shared their radical commitment to a multiracial democracy, Black history and American history would be vastly different. Sadly, America's devotion to democracy ended at the shores of white liberty. The hope and possibility of Black Reconstruction, as W.E.B. Du Bois argued, were extinguished by white backlash against Black freedom, backlash by individual citizens and by the courts. Black women who challenged, supported, and cultivated Black male political insurgency in the late 19th century fought and helped win passage of the 19th Amendment, earning their right to vote in the 20th century. Black suffragettes who first worked for the franchise beginning in the 1830s discovered gender solidarity was no match for white supremacy. Indeed, they learned white women, like white men, used their new voting power to shore up anti-Blackness and suppress Black liberty at every turn. Full Black liberation, at least as it was tied to American jurisprudence, remained elusive until after World War II. With apologies to those committed to fantasies about the greatest generation, those men and women who weathered the Great Depression and saved the world from Nazis, as described by Toms, Brokaw, Hanks, and Steven Spielberg, it is vital that we remember how many of that generation came home after fighting against Hitler and without a trace of irony went back to fighting against liberty, equality, and democracy for Black men and women in America. The true greats of that generation came home from a foreign war, took off their uniforms, and headed down to Southern courthouses to register to vote. We're like Medgar Evers, Hosea Williams, Amesy Moore, and thousands of others. They were turned away, denied their 14th and 15th Amendment rights, despite the nation's victory over fascism across the sea. Black and brown and yellow and red, and yes, some white men and women engaged in a bloody civil rights struggle from 1952 to 1968 that violently took the lives of more than 100 American citizens and saw hundreds more beaten, injured, and jailed. This was the price paid for the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is arguably the most significant piece of civil rights legislation of that era, and the Civil Rights Act of 1968. This costly high point of American democracy undid the egregious legal, economic, and social abuses that defined American apartheid, AKA Jim Crow segregation, which was born in the ashes of Reconstruction. So understand from this rapid-fire, condensed version of African American history, Black people fought for our full humanity, for justice, for our freedom, for ourselves and our progeny, and to claim all the rights of democracy. And in each era, our work and our sacrifices forced the nation to confront the dichotomy between democracy on paper and democracy as a lived experience. We made and are continuing to make this a democratic nation. What does this difficult history, this dark story filled with loss and sadness, have to offer you, those whose futures are so bright? Having quickly walked through the gloomy past, I invite each of you to consider how it is that you will be joining the struggle to maintain and grow American democracy in a moment of reactionary politics, when Americans have joined in lockstep carrying torches and shouting anti-Semitic slogans and menacing fellow citizens. When leaders elected to federal office celebrate the words and deeds of those white supremacists who advocate violence against other Americans here at home and debase themselves by endorsing the worldview of tyrannical dictators abroad. When the nation's highest court has yet again acted to undermine voting rights, women's rights, LGBTQIA rights, when medical misinformation and anti-science propaganda thrives, though 1 million Americans have died in a pandemic. When we have been witness to the national government ripping children from the arms of their mothers seeking refuge at our border. When our very home, the planet Earth, is hot and growing hotter in the face of our refusal to acknowledge the climate crisis and take the necessary steps to address it. First, do not panic. Instead, I say, cultivate empathy, bear witness, and work for justice. Finally, I urge all of you to choose to live. Octavia Butler's novel, The Parable of the Sower, invites readers to engage with the idea of empathetic imagination. Lauren Olamina, the protagonist of the novel, is a hyper-empath, meaning she feels the pain she witnesses in those around her. A Trekkie long before I met Octavia Butler on the page or in the flesh, I had some familiarity with an empath from Gene Roddenberry's space western, the original Star Trek. Still, it was Butler's character, Olamina, who communicated both the danger and the real power of empathetic imagination. How different is the approach to the world if humans lead with empathy toward their fellows rather than sympathy, suspicion, competition, pity, or contempt. Olamina's gift makes her vulnerable to physical and psychic harm from those she would help and those who witness her superhuman trait. Butler, of course, is welcoming readers to think seriously about experiencing and understanding the pain of others, to see others as fully human as we see ourselves. See others, for example, not as those little black children in Chester that need to be rescued during a summers-long engagement funded by the Lang Center, nor as the poor of the developing world to be uplifted and transformed through random acts of charity and upper-class philanthropy, all stepping stones to the next stage of your personal careers. Butler's Olamina has some exciting ideas. For example, all that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. But she does not have magical powers. She cannot fix the structural oppression or personal challenges of the many people she encounters. The problems of her post-apocalyptic moment, like our current moment, are vast and almost overwhelming. Yet and still, her gift means that she sees and experiences the pain of others almost as a piece of herself and acts accordingly. If you find the idea of empathetic imagination as the key to radical change unconvincing, reflect on the Black Lives Matter protest of 2020 in response to the killing of George Floyd. The national and global protest, the largest civil rights protest in American history, grew directly from Floyd's murder. Yes, from the sense of horror, but more importantly, from the profound sense of empathy men, women, and children felt in response to George's deeply human cry for his mother. Those protests brought to mind the words of civil rights icon Ella Baker, quote, "Until the killing of Black men, Black mothers' sons become as important as the killing of white mothers' sons, we who believe in freedom cannot rest." Americans and others around the world felt and embraced, if only for a moment, the idea that the life of a Black mother's son had meaning, had value, and that we should demand justice for his murder. I encourage all of you to work on growing your own empathetic imagination. To begin, as Kendrick Lamar says, be humble, sit down. Ideally with a book, to learn something about all the things you assume you know about other people and other cultures and other traditions because you read an article on X, Y, or Z people in that one class you took 2 years ago. Ask not what you can do to help others as part of what will make you feel better. Instead, ask and act only after growing your knowledge base and building human connection with others, after asking them what is needed in their lives and how you can help address that need. Slow down. Learn to see and listen and develop a sense of empathy about the lives of others. A better democracy requires that we care not just for our own families, but the families of others, whether or not they look like our own, have a different point of origin, or speak a different language. A better future requires we understand the ways all our futures are intertwined. Getting to that understanding begins with an empathetic connection. So let your actions be motivated by an empathetic vibration rather than a sense of superiority rooted in sympathy, or worse yet, pity for those that you suspect or are convinced are less than yourselves. At times, you as an individual will not be able to fix the problem. The fearful problems that confront you may be too great. Your task then is to bear witness, to see, share the pain of human suffering, and tell the tale. Elie Wiesel called on us to bear witness to the Holocaust of World War II. James Baldwin demanded that we bear witness to the brutal murders of those working for civil rights in America. Black Americans have borne witness both to the abuses of the past and our will to survive since the end of slavery. In this moment, when political opportunists are working to sanitize the story of the nation's past and deny the nation's youth the opportunity to learn about the bad and the ugly of American history, along with the good, bearing witness is more vital than ever. Knowledge of the past is essential, a necessary tool to disrupt false narratives about who we are, how we got here, and the possibilities of a democratic future. Make no mistake, new legislation designed to prohibit teaching, which allegedly causes someone to feel guilty or ashamed about the past collective actions of their race or sex, is designed to deflect your focus and disrupt the possibility of children developing empathy for human beings who have experienced harm at the hands of others. Such laws are designed to challenge the memories held by people who experienced the harm of those past actions. These attempts at gaslighting, in the spirit of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, no less, fail to understand the power and the endurance of memory and storytelling in the Black cultural tradition. As Toni Morrison noted, memory weighs heavy in what I write and how I begin and what I find to be significant. The stories of those who bore witness to the past is the first draft of history, and early steps toward progressive change begin by listening to such voices. The 2022 passage of the Emmett Till Federal Anti-Lynching Act is ultimately the consequences of Ida B. Wells' 1895 Red Record, in which she bore witness and documented violence towards and lynching of Black men and women. Bearing witness, which may contemporarily involve a cell phone camera, more often has required only the refusal to look away and to record in memory the horrors before us, and to breathe life into the struggle against injustice by speaking and telling the story. The process of change enabled by bearing witness is not fast or sure. Please note, the Emmett Till Federal Anti-Lynching Act came some 122 years after the first attempt to secure such legislation and after members of the House of Representatives tried some 200 times to criminalize lynching at the federal level. While Ida B. was committed to seeing the crime of lynching end, the current legislation was passed 127 years after her work was first published and 91 years after her death. Her work witnessing informed the work of every legislator and every activist who pushed for a federal anti-lynching law in each era. Her voice challenged the false justifications for public murder of Black men, women, and children, and reverberated down through the years. Bearing witness is part of the work of making progressive change. Change that shifts power and access from the comfortable, the privileged, and the entitled to the vulnerable and the marginalized will take more than your lifetime to achieve, though this should not, must not encourage you to fall into despair, or worse, to lose interest. That a thing is hard and time-consuming, that the positive results may not come tomorrow or next year or the next decade does not make the task unworthy of doing. As Cheryl Eiffel has said, quote, "I don't know of anything in the history of Black people in this country in which it ended and then they gave up. That's just not what we do. We know we work for the future of our children and our grandchildren and their children. I urge all of you to learn to add your voice to that of others who are acknowledging and objecting to violence and to harm. Know that your voice, like that of Ida B. Wells, can be part of a wave of sound that will reverberate and create small fissures, tiny fractures and structures of society, new openings for progressive change to take root." To conclude, let me circle back to being enamored with all things Star Trek. Long before Nikki Giovanni wrote Quilting the Black Eyed Pea, We're Going to Mars, even before Mae Jemison became the first Black woman in space in 1992, I had traveled to the stars with Uhura above the Starship Enterprise. Still, there was no way to know that I would be in my 6th decade of life before the Star Trek series yielded a full-time Black female starship captain. But my patience has been rewarded with Captain Michael Burnham in Star Trek Discovery. The phrase, "choose to live," captured my imagination when I heard it during COVID lockdown. It seemed important and necessary to choose to live when the world was in crisis and struggling with separation and despair. Choose to live spoke to the need to prioritize safety and isolation when we all craved closeness. Choose to live was especially challenging when my mother passed in September of 2020, 3,000 miles from my embrace. And Choose to Live spoke of promise for the future when my grandson Quinn was born a week later, also 3,000 miles away. Recently, the full meaning of the phrase was explained in detail. Quote, "The path you are on has come to an end. Choose to live." Gabriel Burnham, Captain Burnham's sword-wielding mother, offered further instruction. Quote, "Be willing to look inside yourself with absolute candor, and in response, choose your next path. Be willing to devote yourself with integrity only to those people and causes you believe worthy." Choose to live is the last best piece of advice I can offer the Swarthmore College graduates of 2020 and 2022. The path you have been on this past 4 or 5 or 6 years has indeed come to an end. You must now choose to live. moving out into the world equipped with the things that you have learned. Most of those things, practical, ideological, or philosophical, have positively enriched your life. But I submit, if you look inside yourself with absolute candor, you will find some lessons you have learned that are less positive, less useful, and should be jettisoned. I offer 3 brief examples of lessons learned best set aside. The first among them, the idea of self-censorship and the myth of cancel culture. Faced with disagreement in discussion, some of you have learned to remain silent in the classroom, only to rant and vent online after the fact. A few of you have honed skills at personally attacking peers for having the audacity to disagree with your point of view. Sadly, some have not developed the art of argument and intellectual exchange. You have learned instead to center yourself in all things, mistakenly presumed hurt feelings about not having all of your ideas endorsed by classmates or a specific professor is the great injustice of the 21st century. I invite you to look inside yourself with absolute candor and consider the possibility that there are greater concerns in the world than your bruised ego. As a historian, I know historical knowledge requires understanding change over time, context, and contingency, among other things. I think it is fair to say that most knowledge requires expanding one's vision beyond the reflection in the mirror. A second lesson to discard, the belief and the practice of misandry as part of liberatory ideology. Bell Hooks was extraordinarily kind to me in my first year of teaching as a visiting professor at Oberlin College. The gift of her book, Talking Back, Thinking Feminist, Thinking Black, and generosity with her time were transformative. Reading Hooks helped me grow the feminism I had first committed to as a preteen. It has been a bit of a shock then to hear some contemporary students equate a raw, ugly misandry with the life-affirming feminism generated by Hooks, Patricia Hill Collins, and Kimberly Crenshaw, among others. In a moment when women the world over, including in America, find their legal and social status slipping back toward that of chattel in political scenarios best befitting a Margaret Atwood novel, it is important all understand that contempt for one half of the human species by the other half is always dangerous and untenable. Brothers, fathers, uncles, and sons hold up the other half of the sky and must be partners in healing humanity and the planet. Yes, critique, even condemn patriarchy. Yes, there is argue that there is much for men to learn, and equally important, much more to be done to stop violence against women and girls and redistribute power and access across genders. But all this work must be done from the high ground of love for our shared humanity. Look inside yourself with absolute candor and consider all of those that you cherish, those whose life work has opened the path of freedom for others. I honor and cherish the work of Frederick Douglass and Tunis Campbell as much as that of Mary McLeod Bethune and Fannie Lou Hamer, men and women who devoted their lives to the cause of freedom for Black people in America. Lastly, a third lesson to set aside, which is the belief that anti-racism and anti-Blackness can share a playing field. Some of you, while students at Swarthmore College, learned for the first time about the history of systemic racism in America. Many of you recoiled in horror and struggled with the knowledge that past generations of ordinary Americans had built systems that exploited others as part of everyday life. Eager to absolve those individuals in the distant past and recent past, some have argued that the problem is not racism, but Black people. Perhaps, as one bright young man argued in a 2017 public forum on campus, quote, white people would treat Black people better if Black people were different, if they weren't always so critical of white people. See what he did there? In that student's mind, the problem was not racism nor white supremacy, but the fact that Black people bear witness to racism, point out its harms, and that we demand racism end in order to achieve justice. Look inside yourself with absolute candor and ponder what it means if you are more discomforted by those who call out the injury than you are by those who do the harm. If you are more discomforted by people who speak of Black history than you are by the individual who took the lives of 10 Black people in Buffalo on an ordinary weekend shopping trip. 21st century Americans must cease justifying discrimination, exploitation, and violence by arguing, like so many previous generations, that Black people are the problem. It is long since time Americans confront the reality of the role white supremacy has played in our history and the ways in which it morphed and changed over time and continues to distort and damage our democracy. Thank you for listening. It's been an honor and, on occasion, a great joy to join you in the classroom this past 25 years. I wish you lives filled with empathy and a passionate pursuit of justice, because, of course, there is no freedom without justice, and we are all here for freedom.